Hello, everybody. If you have lived as long as 1973 or possibly 1974, you'll probably be aware of the fact that most biblical scholars believe that the rapture would take place in 1988. And recently at a Goodwill store, I found a series of audio tapes that were made relating to the possibility that God was mentioning a generation being 40 years. But I personally believe that it was not 40 years. The audio series is 4 tapes and actually stated on the caption that it was going to be a 70-week period of time and that it represented a actual year of 40 or 40 years. But in my interpretation, a generation actually means 70 years because most people live to be 70. Now, there's another hyperbole to this audio that maybe a generation does literally mean 100 years. And if you have studied Israel's history as a nation, they actually were allowed to return to Israel in 1917 under the Balfour Declaration. The British government made a special Zionist Congress, and so the Jews were permitted to return to Jerusalem in 1917 through 1918. And then 30 years after that, in 1948, is when Israel became a nation. That's when people assume that 40-year time frame began. Now, my interpretation of a generation, as I said before, is 70 years. So 70 from 1948 would be 2018. Another 100 years in interpretation of a generation would be the same year, 2018, because 1918 is when the Jewish population began returning into Jerusalem, into Israel. They weren't interpreting what it said in the Bible correctly as being 70 weeks. It meant literally 70 years. And I personally think that in 2018, either the rapture will happen or that maybe it will be the beginning of the tribulation, which is the 7-year period of time when the Antichrist will begin to torment the world with his new world government. Now it says in the Bible that the Antichrist will have a peace accord with Israel for 3.5 years, and then the last 3.5 years he will break that covenant, and then that's when the abomination of desolation begins, where he goes into Jerusalem and occupies a temple that he will build it, or possibly the Israelites themselves. Israel will rebuild the temple on the old Mount site where Solomon's temple was, and that is when he will thereafter take and occupy the temple and create an actual likeness of himself that will actually come alive. Now, all of this is going to happen during the tribulation. If the tribulation begins in 2018, then 2025 is when it will end. And that is when Jesus returns, defeats the Antichrist at the Battle of Armageddon, and then casts him, Satan, and the false prophet into the bottomless pit for 1,000 years. And this is going to be a big-time disappointment for the Muslims, because they've always been saying that Jesus was a prophet. Hate to tell you this, but Jesus is the Son of God, and he is not a prophet. Muhammad might have been a prophet, but I doubt seriously, because when Jesus returns, I think you're going to have a major war that's going to happen where the Antichrist will probably join up forces with the Muslims, and it will be probably 1/3 of his army that will be used in the Battle of Armageddon. But most people think that by 2020, China will exceed more than probably 500 million people. if not 500 million men. Now, the Bible says 200 million men will be involved in that battle. But I think it will probably be half and half. Half Muslims will join the Antichrist, and the other half will be the Chinese Red Army. And this whole thing just seems to match up with the time when the Balfour Declaration began in 1917, and it was called, as another interpretation, the Zionist Congress, because this is when the Jewish population were allowed by Britain, who already occupied and controlled all of the territory known as Israel at that time, and said the Jewish people can now return to Jerusalem. And up until that time, Jerusalem was not even owned by any particular nation or people, for that matter. The different races that have lived there in the time since Jerusalem was occupied by Rome. It was occupied by the Palestinians. It's been occupied by several different nationalities over the past 2,000 years. But we all know in AD 70 is when all of the Jewish culture was forced out of Jerusalem by the Romans. And nobody can take any credit or actual power of saying we own Jerusalem other than the Israelites, because Israel was in Jerusalem a long time before any Islam ever came into the country. Islam has always been based out of Saudi Arabia in Mecca, and anybody who says different, I'm sorry, but you got to go back to your history books. If not, go to the Bible, and it'll tell you exactly what happened. The thing that has to be watched in the last 5 or 6 years about our country in America has been how Obama has just totally adorized and given total homage to the Islamic community. And a lot of people believe that he is a Muslim himself, and I think from what I have seen and what I've heard from people who say that he prays 5 times a day, that there is no stipulation of how many times you pray to Jesus or to the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. It doesn't say anything about that. Now, if you're a Muslim, you have to pray 5 times or 3 times a day, facing east. And nobody's going to probably ever confirm that fact to us, but I guarantee you, I bet you Obama is doing it. Many of you are probably familiar with Hal Lindsey. Now, he's a known author who in the 1970s, especially 1974, he did a series of books dealing with the rapture and the coming tribulation. He also did a very famous movie. It was called The Late Great Planet Earth, and it starred Orson Welles. He did the narration. But what I kept myself was a comic book. It was called There's a New World Coming. But in the movie where Orson Welles did the narration, Hal Lindsey appeared in the film, and he made the statement that most people who were studying it at that time felt that in 1988, that was when Jesus would return. And he still does a weekly Bible prophecy program, I believe, on the Trinity Broadcasting Network. And I'm not trying to plug him, but I'm just saying he is really the oldest person I know in the biblical prophecy group that's out there talking about the rapture. And I haven't heard him say that 2018 would be the year. But from what I know of history itself, 1917 to 1918 is that time frame when the Jewish people, the culture itself, was allowed to return to their native land in Israel. Now, Israel, as we know it today, is not what it was originally. Jordan actually took some of their territory, and they still have it. Now, what the Bible describes is when the Battle of Armageddon happens, they are going to be able to reacquire a lot of the land that was taken from them, and they are going to reacquire even a larger part of that part of the Middle East. But this will only happen after the Battle of Armageddon, because everybody knows when the final battle happens with Satan and the Antichrist, there's going to be a new Jerusalem that will actually come from heaven, and it will actually occupy, we don't know exactly how much of that landmass that represents the Middle East, but I would have to say there's not going to be much of the Middle East left, because when God returns his city to Jerusalem, it's going to be probably 10 times as big as it is now. And you're going to have a massive temple there, you know, where the Dome of the Rock is. So anybody who believes that Muhammad is coming again, or that any temple that's built there will be for the Islamic community, that's not going to happen, because the Antichrist himself is going to initially take possession of any type of temple that's built there. But we have to see something happen very, very much first. And that is, the Bible says to us that God will destroy the temple that's there now. He said the temple will be destroyed, and most likely God himself will destroy it. He'll probably use an earthquake, or he'll use something, lightning, whatever. It'll be obliterated from that place, that sacred place of the temple. The Dome of the Rock is going. We don't know when, but we know it is going to happen, and then the Israelites, or the people of Israel, will rebuild it. And the Bible even says it'll be rebuilt within 3 days. Most of those engineers in Israel have said they have the ability to rebuild the temple within a possible 2 or 3 month period of time. So I don't know. I mean, maybe they can fabricate a temple there within 3 days and then build the main temple later. But we know that's what the Bible says is going to happen. Now, the Muslims are going to probably be caught off guard. When that takes place, then a lot of other things are going to start happening. There's going to be 2 prophets going to show up on the streets of Jerusalem. They're going to start prophesying. The Antichrist will eventually get ticked off at them. He'll shoot them down, and their bodies will be left in the street dead, and then God is going to resurrect them in 3 days, and they're going to start prophesying all over again. So I'm telling you, this time in history is going to be not only ironic, but it's going to be the most wonderful moment in human history, because finally people are going to get it right as far as the facts. The Muslims are going to find out that Muhammad is not real, and that Jesus was and is still the Son of God, and right now he's in heaven on the right hand of God the Father on the throne. And when he returns, folks, it says in the Bible one thing: every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And that's not going to mean that Muslims have any immunity or exclusion. Everybody is going to say that. Everybody is going to acknowledge. And that's why Jesus is returning, to put everything right, to clean up the mess that is inevitably going to happen. I don't know if it's Obama who's the Antichrist. I think he could be a stooge for whoever he is. But if the tribulation is going to start in 3 years' time, I think that the church is going to be gone by that time. And I just hope it happens soon. Thank you all.